What's going on? What's going on? It's your boy Storyseller Jet with another episode of the Datz So Fire Talk Show. And today we have a fantastic guest on the show. And I've been looking forward to these days for, I don't know, like 6 months, a year
Me
since
too.
we originally talked about, you becoming on the show. Super exciting. This lady over here is fantastic. And I cannot wait to delve deep into this conversation. And I think this is probably gonna be one of the best talk show that we've had. So Annie, welcome to the show. Super excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I cannot imagine being any other place right now. This is going to be perfect.
Let's go.
Woo!
We're gonna start by making a little introduction of yourself, and then we're gonna delve into the conversation.
Okay.
So the first question I have for you: who is Annie Yatch?
Oh my goodness. Who is Annie Yatch? I think starting off, I used to be known as like Mr. and Mrs. Smith because I was married to a Navy SEAL before, and that was a blast in that persona. But I think today, I'm just someone who's passionately excited about people stepping out of any trauma patterns so that they can step more into their calling as entrepreneurs. That's really what lights my fire.
Wow. If you're watching this show, it's going to be fantastic. So we typically talk about the entrepreneur journey, the successes, the failures. And this show is fantastic because you are the one that helps a lot of these entrepreneurs that facing major adversities or failures and getting them back on track. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So let's go back to day one. How did you get started in this journey?
Oh my gosh, day one. Well, my grandfather was an entrepreneur and I never knew that was a thing in our family, really. But what day one started me in the journey was at the time, had been married to a Navy SEAL. He had gotten horribly injured overseas and he literally had lost his purpose. And I remember he said to me, he's like, Annie, I'm not useful anymore in this role. I've been in for 10 years. Like, what am I going to do now? He's like, should I just become like a surf bum and be on, the side of a beach somewhere? I was like, there's so much incredible genius in your brain. I'm like, what if we could take that genius in your brain of being a Navy SEAL and basically backwards engineer it into a system that normal people could use every single day to get that mental edge and more clarity in their business? And so really in that moment, I guess I became an entrepreneur because I was like, let's monetize or let's take this incredible genius and push it out to normal people because I was a normal person. I'm not a Navy SEAL. But I was like, what could I learn that could make me better at all things in life? So that's where it all began, my entrepreneurial journey. And I didn't even know it was an entrepreneurial journey at the time, right? Because I was just like, how do I solve a problem? How do I make this better? How do I help this man step into more of his purpose so he can impact more people?
That is fantastic. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs out there, that is probably the major thing that they struggle with. What is the purpose? Why am I doing this? Why am I spending, nights and days and things like, working on the dream? What are some of the things that you can share for somebody that is struggling to finding their purpose in their workplace?
Well, I think for people that are struggling to find their purpose, it's really the first thing you should be looking at if you're going into building a business or being an entrepreneur. Because if you don't have that purpose defined and you don't have a filter for your brain around that purpose, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions that send you off track and waste a lot of time and money. So that purpose piece is really the most important thing that you can do with your time if you're starting a business, if you're in business already, because you don't know if that vehicle that you've chosen to build your business is actually in alignment with your purpose or your calling.
That's awesome. I was working on, by the way, shout out to CG. I think CG
Shout
and
out to
BA
CG.
are
Yes.
two of the groups that you were are part
100%.
of. That this is where I've met you. But shout out to CG. Um, I was working on your CG CEO video, and
Okay.
I remember like a picture that I found on your social media, and it was you holding a gun.
Oh, yes, the AR-15.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wish, eventually for this show, I want to build it like Jimmy Fallon or something. And sometimes it has pictures of
Oh
people.
my
I
gosh,
should have
yes.
printed that picture.
You should have. It's so good.
Yeah.
From my Mrs. Smith days.
Yeah. This is
Yeah.
that's awesome. Um,
I mean, we can bring that AR. It was a custom design build. It was
yeah.
amazing. We used to have a defensive fitness, firearms, and fighting facility where we would do CrossFit workouts while we were shooting guns on a defensive range. So that was the original first business.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about that business. Why did you guys get that started?
Well, it was really interesting. We had a friend of ours who had a custom, basically a custom curriculum that they were using on board ships to teach people how to shoot guns in a much safer, faster way so that they would make people more effective and efficient with the guns than you would if you were FBI trained. And so we saw this curriculum, Larry and I, and we are both like, gosh, this is an incredible curriculum. What if we could bring this and partner up with ranges all across the country and really change how families and, entrepreneurs think about using their guns for safety?
Wow.
And so that was where that first started. It ended up being a 10,000 square foot shooting facility that we built
Really?
out that was custom, that then we would sell across the country in partnership with the curriculum and the firing range. So that was the first business.
Yeah.
Learned a lot of lessons there, a lot of hard lessons there for sure.
Let's dig deep in those lessons. Obviously, this show, one of the things that I would like to do from this is like sharing some of the failures or lessons that you've learned along the way that you can use to impart that knowledge to other people. So, what are some of the things that you faced during that business and how did you overcome them?
Well, to give you perspective on this, I think there was a point of time where Larry and I both had probably worked 18-hour days for 60 days straight.
Wow.
We hadn't slept more than 3 or 4 hours a night because we were building out this facility. We were training the instructors. We were diving into the curriculum. We were building it out, getting investors. And I will never forget, we also had to then run the conceal and carry classes. And I was always the bad guy. So I would get shot with these, fake sim rounds over and over and over again. And I would go home bruised up and down. It looked like I had been in a fight. And I remember thinking, like, there's got to be a better way to be an entrepreneur. But some of the biggest failures that we had at the beginning were we didn't know anything about culture. We didn't know anything about managing people. We didn't know anything about how to delegate effectively. And it was ironic for us because as we started really working with bigger teams, because we had 40 instructors at one point, we started looking at ourselves and figuring out what is it that we are not good at that we really have to improve upon. So we spent a good chunk of time learning how to manage people effectively because that was not one of our skill sets. And if you look at all the teams out there, more often than not, we are not taught to manage people. We are taught to try to be the leaders, to get in the trenches with people. But that is actually not what most teams need, which is ironic. So that was one of our first failures, not knowing how to build culture, not knowing how to build a team, not knowing how to manage people, and then not knowing how to delegate.
Yeah. That is so fascinating. And I thank you for sharing that. And for me, I would say this is probably one of the greatest like struggle that we have on a daily basis. Culture and like, as a leader, how to inspire the team and doing all the other stuff. And funny enough, I don't know if you were part of that. Maybe 2 years ago, I did purchase Larry's book. Were you a part of that book?
I was. Larry and I actually, we spent a good amount of time working on that book. And where that book came from was we had a curriculum we put together for fifth graders in middle school to help prevent bullying because we thought that bullying wasn't the issue, that leadership was actually the issue. And so we had a bunch of curriculum for fifth graders. And the CEO of a really big company in Minnesota reached out to us and he was like, my fifth graders curriculum on honor is really incredible. Would you guys bring this into my company? And it was 3M. And so we ended up bringing that fifth graders education into 3M to teach their executive team. And once that happened, all of a sudden everything sort of took off for us. So that curriculum was the game changer that took us from the facility to then bringing it into companies across the country.
If you had to summarize maybe one or two major key points from that book, or
Yes.
something that somebody would learn from it, what would that be?
Gosh, the book
That is a big question.
That book is so good. The book is called How Leadership Actually Works. And what I love most about this book is that we have 6 pillars of leadership. And if you don't, follow the progression of the pillars, then you really can't lead or manage your team in the most effective way. But my favorite chapter is on self-regulation because self-regulation is literally the way that you mentally, emotionally, and physically manage yourself. And if you look at all the behavior issues that we have in business, it all goes back to behavior. Everybody has a behavior that needs to change to take them to the next level of their own leadership. So, what's your behavior? And so, when you study self regulation, you learn really quickly that the brain is hyper focused on building this, but only when you really spend the time, energy, and effort to put things into your emotional bank. And so, when you work on emotional regulation, self regulation around the physical side, say for example you want to get better at working out, right? You don't stop on that last set. You give yourself one more set to try to really hurt that muscle. It's the same thing if you're trying to master yourself emotionally. Instead of reaching for that beer at the end of the day, you give yourself 5 minutes before you reach for the beer just to give your brain the chance to decide, I'm going to wait just a few more minutes. And that builds that muscle. So then you become better and better at self mastery. So
That
it's a
is
really
fantastic.
exciting chapter. I love that one.
That is really cool. So going back to building a culture, what are
Mhm.
some of advice that you would give to somebody that wants to build a better culture as part of the organization?
Building culture is a tough one, but what I've found is that if you start with the same language and your team has the same definitions for things, like we had an issue on our team because we didn't know how to define success. Success wasn't, the objective of, we want to go after this level of revenue. What it was for us was we redefined success as an optimized environment that you sustain over time. And when we thought about that, we're like, well, that would change the whole business. If everybody could optimize their environment every day and sustain that change over time, then really success isn't about the numbers anymore. It's about a feeling. And so when we started shifting success into being that feeling and defining the feeling for everybody in the group and helping them define it, suddenly we have the same language, right? We have the same filter. And then our culture started to develop in a much better way. And what's funny about this is I didn't even realize it, but the Navy SEAL teams, when they go out to plan the most impossible missions, they go to plan impossible missions and they're doing it focused on a feeling that they want to create at the end. Now, if only all of us in the corporate world were like, okay, we want to go after a goal, but it's really the feeling of the goal. It's not the goal itself that's going to motivate our team. Our culture would be completely different.
Boom. That's fire, baby.
Fire baby.
I typically say that when there is such a great nugget. That was really good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now let's fast forward. I guess before we go and talking about that, are there any other businesses that you've launched before the ones that you currently have?
Yes. So we had the middle school and high school curriculum on leadership and leadership development. And that was, I think, in maybe 40 to 50 different schools, 60,000 kids were impacted. So that
Oh
was
my
one of the
goodness.
businesses. And what I loved most about it was a little girl had sent me a video who was in the program. And what she said to me was, she goes, Miss Annie, because that's what they call me. They're like, Miss Annie, the coolest thing I learned in this lesson that I can be weird. And if I'm weird, it's because I'm innovative. And so I stopped thinking about myself as being weird and being lonely and all those things, but I started thinking of myself as being innovative now. And only if you're really weird can you do truly incredible things in life.
Wow.
And so this little girl gained a lot of confidence from it. And so that was one of my favorite things we did. Even though it might not have generated a ton of revenue, it definitely changed the lives of about 60,000 kids.
That is
So
fantastic.
that was one of my
Yeah.
favorite things. But we had that business. We had the 10,000 square foot defensive fighting fitness and firearms facility, which was just wild. I mean, you're like doing CrossFit workouts, which are hard enough, and then you're shooting on the range at the same time and moving and shoot. I mean, the whole thing was insanely cool. We used to run date nights and spy dates out of that facility too, where
Wow.
couples could come in, have a great dinner, learn how to shoot a gun safely and defuse a fake bomb. I mean, we had so much fun at that one. But the final one that we did was SEAL Team Leaders, which was the one that focused on leadership and team development. And then from there, since I evolved out of that, I'm now doing just North Star Leadership, which is coaching people to work through these trauma patterns and get out of their own way so they can make a lot more money and make a lot more impact.
That is fantastic. This is the highlight of the show today, and we're gonna delve deep on that now. What made you start North Star Leadership?
At the time, my now ex husband, Larry, he had sort of decided he was going to move on with SEAL Team Leaders, and now he's working with that great Aspire conference group. And I decided I really wanted to spend some one on one time going deep into these patterns that I knew were in people's blind spots. Because over the past 15 years, the biggest blind spot that Larry had was something that held him back in business for so long. And it wasn't until we addressed his nervous system being out of whack that we went from making, say, 40 grand a month to 195 grand, right? So that's a pretty significant shift there.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was all linked back to the neurochemistry.
That
So,
that is fantastic. So North Star Leadership,
mhm.
I found the name very curious. Why did you name it North Star Leadership?
Well, I named it North Star Leadership because what I found is that everybody needs a North Star. That North Star in your brain is the filter that determines what your subconscious and your conscious mind allow you to see. If you don't have a North Star, if you don't have a new filter, your subconscious is going to run 97% of your thoughts. And your subconscious is then based on that 7-year-old in your mind who really doesn't have a clue. That 7-year-old is still attached to all the stories from childhood. And so my goal was let's give people a new North Star. Let's give them a new filter for how their brain works so that they can go after their goals and really knock it out of the park in business.
That is fantastic. Can you share with me a little bit of the curriculum or the different things that you teach people as going through the North Star leadership?
For me, I know that there are different ways to sort of make an algorithm for how to manage and support someone through trauma. Therapists are doing it now, but my issue was always we need an action plan. I need someone to be able to shift so rapidly from one way of thinking to another way of thinking, but there's so many emotions tied to the earlier way of thinking. So what I did was I sort of went out and researched and went through a ton of different modalities to try to figure out what are the best modalities to make the quickest breakthrough in people's lives and how they think about themselves. And what I did was I wove those incredible breakthroughs into the coaching that I do. So not only are we looking at like how do we have emotional breakthroughs, intellectual breakthroughs, business breakthroughs, trauma breakthroughs, but we're also looking at how do we take our brains to that limitless space where the neurochemistry is boosted and higher functioning. If anyone's seen the movie Limitless, you know what I'm talking
Oh
about
yeah.
because everyone's like, what's that pill? What's that capsule? How do I get that so my brain can expand? Well, it's a combination of boosting the neurochemistry and working on those trauma patterns to get you out of your own way.
Yeah.
So that's the curriculum.
That is fantastic. Earlier today, we were talking about how like early childhood affects a lot of people where
Yes.
they are at today.
Mhm.
Whether people that start their businesses probably because a trauma that they've sustained when they were young.
Yes.
Can you talk about that specifically, like how the trauma that you've had as a child is really impacting you today, and if you find a way to um, unveil that or remove that, that could like make you become limitless.
So, what I've found is that trauma is just a perceived loss of control. And so, when we think about it, we always think there's big trauma, right? Like a car wreck, loss of a child, loss of a parent. But what I've found is that these smaller traumas, like the subtle trauma of, say, a parent locking you in your bedroom because you were bad, that can cause such great change in your mind because you're locked in a room, you don't know what's happening in the outside world. Suddenly, control is all that matters to you. When you finally get out of that room, you want to be in more control than you've ever been in your whole life. And then you build businesses where you're in control of everything. And what was interesting was I had one gentleman, and he had been closed off in his room. Now, for some of us, that might not have made an impact, but on him, it did. He decided that because he had been closed away from his parents, that his parents had died, and he decided he was never going to have another connection with another person.
Wow.
So he built his first 5 businesses with no emotional connection with anybody that he worked with, made a ton of money. But then when he wanted to get married, he realized he couldn't sustain connection with a partner. And so that's when I found him. And he was like, well, how do I sustain a connection with a partner? I've made all this incredible money, built all these businesses, but I cannot sustain connection. How am I going to have a family? And so once we unraveled where that story came from, he realized that he had decided very early on as a 7-year-old that he could not be in connection with anybody. So we had to shift that story completely. Now he's married, he has a daughter, he's so happy with his life, his businesses are still doing great, but he never could have had that feeling of fulfillment if he hadn't looked back at his trauma story.
Wow, that's incredible. And I think one of the most like because I am really great friends with him too is somebody from CG that you've been able to help,
Mhm.
Brad Schindler.
Oh, yes, yes.
And he has like a fantastic story, and I love all the stuff that he's doing now too. I went and filmed with him in DC. I think he's in the DC area,
Mhm.
and he was like talking about all the different things and how impactful you were
Oh,
to
thank
him,
you.
and doing all the other stuff. What are some of the most rewarding stories that you have been able to do because of the people that you've helped?
Yeah, I think one of the most rewarding stories was Brad and his son because anytime somebody comes to me and they, have a moment with their child where their child is, inconsolable on the sort of edge of deciding if they want to be here or not, to watch not only Brad change dramatically, right? He went from somebody who was on a bunch of drugs to suddenly being like, I'm completely happy, not being on any drugs and just enjoying my life and knowing who I am. And then his son went from, on the verge of wanting to harm himself to, going into becoming almost a pro golfer. I mean, it's just incredible to watch these stories. But my favorite story, other than, watching my ex-husband become a much better father and a better businessman because he got more emotionally connected after working on his stuff. Recently I had another chance to help another SEAL and to watch him go from being on that edge of not being sure if he wants to be here anymore to taking command of his entire life and resetting everything. It's when you watch people have these great breakthroughs, they get more connected to what lights them up, they make more money, they make more impact. Like everything in the world opens up when they do this level of work. So for me, there's nothing better than watch somebody dramatically change in front of your eyes so that they have everything they now want in their life.
That is
That's why I do what
fantastic.
I do. I love
I
it.
love it. This is so fascinating. I would like you just mentioned something over here, and I would like to get a little bit deeper on
Sure.
it. Um, how can you parent your child without, sending them into like trauma?
All right. Well, this is a good topic because I have to tell all of you parents out there who are probably listening, we are going to traumatize our children in some way. We just are, right? And so the one thing I would tell you as a parent is at least there are great resources out there for you. But the first thing we can do if we don't want to traumatize our parent or our children as much as we were traumatized is we really have to look at ourselves and we have to decide what behaviors do I need to change so that my children do not take on those behaviors through osmosis. So one of the reasons why my ex-husband and I got divorced is because we both looked at our lives and we're like, we don't want our kids to see and think that this is love. We care about each other, we're great friends, but it's a different version when you're, madly in love with someone. And so he and I were like, we really have to do this for our kids. We have to figure out how do we separate in a beautiful, positive, supportive way so that our kids can see both of us extremely happy and in love. And so we knew if we didn't do that, we'd probably traumatize the kids and they'd probably choose partners that were not loving partnerships. And so that's how we knew that we needed to make a change. But I find that most times we're, as parents, we're overwhelmed, we're exhausted, right? And these little kids watch us be reactive to so much, and then they build those same reactions. So while we can't prevent our kids from being traumatized, we can do the work on ourselves to be more present, to calm our nervous systems, and to give them a chance to see parents being non reactive. So usually it's when parents come to me and they say, oh, my child has this behavior. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at your behavior because that child's behavior is stemming from whatever it is you are or you are not doing. And usually within an hour, I can identify what it is. We can shift the pattern, we can move them forward, and the child gets better and healthier because of it. So we're going to traumatize our kids. There are resources and there is support, but do the work on you first, and then the trauma gets a lot less.
Fire. I hope
Yeah.
you're listening to that. And I think that was a really great insight into that. And I definitely would be mindful of that the
There's a
next
really
time.
good book too that I would tell all the parents that are listening. It's called How to Talk So Your Children Will Listen, How to Listen So Your Children Will Talk.
Wow.
Blew my mind the difference in how you would engage with your children after you read this book. I think all parents have to know about it.
That is fantastic. I'm definitely going to be buying that book, and I hope you will too. Now let's talk about one of the things that you teach as part of the curriculum of North Star Leadership, which is the four leadership gap. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Yes. So after working with probably, gosh, thousands of companies over the past 15 years, my ex husband and I, we identified there were really three big leadership gaps. But the fourth one, I believe, is the most important, which is that trauma gap, right? Because as entrepreneurs, we literally become entrepreneurial because we're trying to solve problems and we're trying to have more control in our life, which stemmed from the chaos of something that happened when we were young between the age of 7 and 10. So if we know that that trauma is going to cause an issue and we don't resolve it or even look at it until we're in a business experience, we're going to create bad business partnerships. We're going to cost ourselves a lot of time and money with mistakes with regards to the culture of our people. So we might have to go through a lot of layoffs. We might have to go through rounds and rounds of people to try to find the right team. And if we know that that trauma exists, but we don't do anything with it, it is going to sabotage us. That's what I find most entrepreneurs come to me and they're like, I think I'm self sabotaging. I think I'm an imposter. What have I done wrong? And it almost always can go back to that story between the age of 7 and 10. So the trauma is the first gap that most people are not addressing. Second gap is usually delegation. So even though we want to build and scale and grow a team, we ourselves as entrepreneurs, we are not great at delegating. If we were, we'd already have a team that was 10, 20 people strong and it'd be moving like clockwork. So there's a whole piece on how do we learn to delegate more effectively. Then there's the feedback gap, which is all about how do we give and receive feedback in a way that doesn't make somebody very uncomfortable or defensive. Because the second someone is to come uncomfortable or defensive, giving or receiving feedback, literally you have lost at least a week of productivity from them because they're going to be in their head looping on why somebody gave them the feedback that they gave them. So we got trauma, we've got delegation, we have feedback gap, and then we have the planning gap. So what I've found is that almost all entrepreneurs are very good at contingency planning because we're always trying to solve problems, But our teams are never good at contingency planning because they've never had a chance to learn. And we don't take the time as entrepreneurs to train them in how to contingency plan. So those are the four gaps that we've seen across every business, whether it's $1 million business or a $1.2 billion business. And if you can resolve those four gaps, everything in business gets better.
Awesome. I would love to learn more about each of those, and maybe sharing like, your greatest tape. And obviously, if anybody watching this and would like to learn more, obviously reach out.
Of
Again,
course.
she is fantastic, and she's, part of my French, a badass.
Badass.
Obviously, with the gun, that's where I was headed to earlier when
The
I
AR-15.
had that AR-15. But
Yes.
um, let's start with, what is your greatest advice? How a leader
Mhm.
can have a greater feedback, like solve that feedback gap.
So, my greatest advice on feedback would probably be that we have to do feedback differently. It's not about constructive criticism, it's about we have to be in such connection with ourselves, understanding why we're asking for feedback or giving feedback to somebody else instead of pinpointing their poor behavior. What typically happens is you'll do something quote unquote wrong. I'll come to you and be like, when you did this, it was a real problem and we can't do this anymore. But then the person feels like they've erred, they're to blame, they get down on themselves, and they go into their own cycle of lack of self belief, right? Instead, what I'd like to see happen is I want to reflect on why is that person's behavior causing me such an issue? What is it in me that is being triggered by their behavior? Because if I then go to that individual and I say, you know what, this is the story that I'm making up about how you engage with me on this. Is it true or is it not? And the other person almost always is going to say, no, that story is not true. I'm not trying to make you feel that way at all. I actually had a really good intention. I was trying to do it this way. And we often forget that people have good intentions with their behavior. They're not trying to be malicious. They just maybe don't have all the information. And that's when it goes back to delegation. Because if we don't have all the information, we're going to make mistakes. Then we're going to be receiving feedback, getting defensive because of that feedback, and our productivity drops. So, this is why delegation and feedback are so key. But for feedback, you have to ask, what is the story that I'm making up that is linked to this person's behavior?
This is fantastic, and I'm taking a little note on that right now. And also, there is a book that I've been reading too that kind of goes back to that, is like crucial conversation. Have you
Yes.
heard
Mhm.
of that book?
I
Have you
have.
read it?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, something that you just mentioned in there, and that was like probably from the maybe like first two or three chapters, is like the stories that you're telling
Mhm.
yourself. And actually, like this past like Monday, we were doing our L10 meeting, and I ended up using some of the terms like that and say, hey, maybe this is, the story that I'm telling myself is this, but that may not be true, and
Right.
doing all of that. So fantastic tip.
It's
Thank you for
so
sharing
helpful.
that.
So helpful. It saved me many times.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now let's go to delegation. What is the greatest tip that you would give to somebody, how to delegate, to their, team?
So there's usually a four-step process to delegation that I walk people through in a workshop. But what I would say the biggest miss for almost every entrepreneur is that when you hand something off to somebody else, you almost never mention to them why it is going to help them to take on this project. We always talk about why it helps the business, why it helps their team, why it helps the vision of the company. But very rarely does any entrepreneur turn to their team member and say, I need you to do this for me because this is how it's going to motivate or help you succeed in a greater way. So that why is almost always left out. But if you think about that other person, are they going to be more or less engaged? If you say to them, this is how this is going to immediately impact you and help you, more engaged because they will want to do that and get it done as quickly as possible because it will dramatically reflect on them and their success if we share the why with them.
Awesome.
So that's the biggest gap.
Yeah, I wish I had like one of those mics over here so I can just pull it and then just like mic drop
Oh,
over here.
thanks.
So we talk about feedback, we talked about delegation, we talked a little bit about trauma, but we can
Mhm.
expand on that a little bit more later. What was the fourth?
Contingency planning.
Contingency planning. Can we talk
Yes.
about that a little bit? And what is your greatest tip or advice as it relates to contingency planning?
So for contingency planning, there are a couple of things that I want to mention here. The first thing is that for almost every CEO I've ever worked with, whether they were making $1 million or they were making 1.2 billion, the biggest problem is they have expectations in their head and they do not communicate those expectations. And they also think that what they think is common sense. And so they don't explain what their view of common sense is. So you have a bunch of people on their team that don't know how to think like they do, don't understand their expectations, and they get annoyed by their team members because what they assume is common sense, nobody else has, because their common sense is actually their genius. And so when I talk to entrepreneurs all the time, I'm like, okay, let's break down how you contingency plan and let's teach it to your team weekly so your team can start developing the skill set for themselves. And that's usually where they see a huge uptake in business revenue because the team now is thinking more like they are and their expectations are very clearly outlined.
That is fantastic. I'm going back to the delegation. You mentioned earlier that there is like a four-step process that you typically take people through as when you're teaching them about delegation. Can you quickly go through those four steps? And obviously, if you want to learn more about that, you can reach out to Annie. But quickly, can you highlight those four steps for us?
Of course, I'd be happy to. So the first step is always the why, right? We have to identify what is the why for the individual first. Why would you ask them to do this? And how does it immediately impact them to say yes to this task? The second one is a standard of performance. We want to make sure that when you hand something to someone, they understand the standard by which you would do something. Because more often than not, if we expect our team member to understand the standard, but we've never walked through it with them, there is absolutely no way they're going to hit our standard. So I like to be very clear. Like if I'm going to assign, say, a phone call, a Zoom call to someone, I'll be like, okay, if I'm doing the Zoom call, I show up 10 minutes early to the Zoom. I show up with this attire on. I show up with this slide deck prepped. I show up with this type of a mood that I'm creating. And this is the end state of what I want to happen at the end of the call. So normally who would be like, oh, yeah, I'll take that Zoom for you, no problem. And then they get that from me and they're like, wow, this is a definite standard of performance. I said, yeah, this is the standard of excellence that I want you to be in because this is representation of both of us. And that usually will connect with someone. So the second piece is you have to have a standard performance that's very clearly outlined. Then you have to give people the power to act. The biggest issue in delegation is people get stuck because they don't know what to do next and they don't want to come back to you and look weak or like they didn't know what they were doing. So we have to talk through with them. Okay, if you get stuck in any of these three places, what will you do? How will you overcome it? And sometimes I'll even say to people, well, what personality trait could get you stuck? What fear could get you stuck? Because again, I want them to have pre thought through all these options before they come back to me with an issue. And then lastly is the personal commitment. You have to get the other person to commit to accomplish something by a set deadline and they have to speak it out loud. So if I say, oh, you're going to do this by Friday, right? And the person's like, oh, yeah, I'll get it done by Friday. They're not actually committing to anything. So what I started saying instead was, are you willing to commit to getting this done by a certain date? And then I'll ask them by what date and what time, because they have to tell me what they're committing to. I can't make them hold a commitment that they're not making. So those are the four main steps. There's a lot more that goes into each step, but those are the basic ones. If you can just do that every time, whether in voice note or in an email, even though it seems like a lot, people will hit their deadlines much faster and much quicker. And you won't have to worry that they come back to you with a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think this is probably for us. This is one thing that I feel like we can get better. Like again, in on Monday when we were having our Elton meeting,
Mhm.
I was very aware that some of the things that we could do and do better, I'm probably the culprit of it.
We all are. We all are.
Like talking about the delegation stuff and doing all of the other stuff. And I feel like this week's has been fantastic too because of like some of the set expectation and
Mhm.
things that we've discussed in our Monday meeting. And today is like, Wednesday.
And you talking about the story too, that
Yeah,
you're like, maybe I'm telling a story here. That was perfect, right? It
yeah,
makes you more human for your entire team.
that is awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was a really great tip. And
Of
I'm
course.
definitely going back personally to listen on
Mhm.
that and try to apply that to my life and my business as well.
Love it.
Um, Earlier today, we were also talking about the trauma gap.
Mhm.
Let's expand on that a little bit. I feel like you said that's the most important part of the
It
business
is.
and the things that you are doing.
Mhm.
And I feel like a lot of people, like, that is what is like keeping their ceilings, like to
It
really
is
achieve
100%.
what they want to do. So let's dig a little bit on that for that. How can somebody identify their trauma, the things that are like, really holding them back?
So there are a bunch of different ways, but I get asked this question a lot because they're like, well, if I can't work with you, how do I figure this out? Right. So the easiest way I've found for people to identify this trauma is if you look at your life and you look at where are the areas of my life where I'm suffering. right? So if I were to ask anybody, I'd say, okay, where are the areas of your life where you're suffering? You might hear people say their relationship. You might say, oh, the revenue of my business isn't where I want it to be. But usually, where there's an area of suffering, it means your subconscious is telling you a lie there that you need to resolve. So, for example, when I was a little girl, my parents were great parents, but we had three kids under the age of 5 and a dog. And my mom would make three-course dinners for my dad every night to make sure that he came home to like something delicious, right? And in that time, I would spend a lot of time working with my sisters to help them with their homework. And it was always, Annie, if you can help your sisters get their homework done, then you can play afterwards. But by the time we got homework done and we ate dinner together, then it was bedtime. So I never really got to do all that playtime. So I was always taking care of people. So what I realized was, oh my gosh, look at this. I've been taking care of other people my whole life. It makes sense that I wouldn't naturally feel like putting myself first would be a normal thing to do. So that little 7-year-old kid in business was like, I want to take care of everybody. So I always had beautiful connections with people on the team, with clients. But when it came to taking care of myself, I wasn't as good at it. So once you identify that thing from your childhood that's holding you back, you can really move yourself forward and it becomes the key to everything. I just like to give that example because it really, you need these personal examples to better understand, well, how does my trauma affect me? What would this cause? How could this be a problem?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's almost always tied to the revenue you create.
Yeah.
Some behavior is tied to the revenue that you either create or don't.
And I feel like I need like 5 days with you to just discuss all of that things. That was a fantastic tip. Thank you for sharing that
You're welcome.
as well. Um, do you help people with? I know Brad helps people with like
He does hypnotherapy, I think. Yes.
hypnotherapy. Is that something that you do
I
as well?
don't. I found that hypnotherapy is great as one of the tools in your toolkit, but I had to amass about 30 different tools in the toolkit because you really have to be able to rewire the subconscious, rewire the conscious. You have to rewire the mindset. You have to rewire the purpose. There's just a lot of layers to this work. And I do agree that a lot of it does go back to self love, but I've just found there's so much complexity to people's trauma patterns that you really have to go pretty deep to make sure that you make that change really sustainable.
Yeah. And all that trauma part really affect a lot of different things and also even affects building partnership.
It does.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know that earlier we were
Mhm.
discussing a little bit about building partnership, how different trauma kind of can affect how successful somebody can be as part of a partnership.
Yes. Well, I had a client and he's just a genius, like NASA engineer client of mine. And he had asked me, he said, you know, Annie, I think I've built partnerships in the past that haven't been the most sustainable or the most helpful for the business. So we spent some time looking at his past partnerships and there was a common theme for all of them. All of those common themes went back to his father and how he interacted with his father. And so what was cool for us is I was like, okay, now any partner that you want to bring in, you got to run them by me first so that we can talk through, is this a good partnership for you? Or is it the trauma pattern partnership? And for probably 2 or 3 different partners, all the ones he was attracting were all that same trauma pattern from his dad.
Wow.
And I would catch it every time, like, nope, you're not partnering. Nope, you're not partnering. And then finally he brought me someone because he had done a lot of work. He had attracted somebody completely different who was 100% aligned with his values, his process, his character. He's like, Annie, I think this one might be a good one. And we ran this process just to double check it. He and this business partner. At the end of it, they were so connected. They're so on the same page. They were like, now we can actually do a partnership and have it be fruitful. And it's been fruitful ever since. So those are the types of things I'm like, if you're thinking about going into partnership with someone and you don't know about these trauma patterns, you could literally be choosing in or opting in to a greater trauma pattern that limits you and your growth in business even more, or it limits your ability to scale your team, or it limits your ability to, build the relationships that you want.
Yeah, that is great. You kind of answered that a little bit, but I would like to answer that question mostly because of reels. What are some of the dangers of somebody choosing a partner that has a similar trauma pattern with them?
So if you choose a partner who has a similar trauma pattern to you, it just means that the two of you are going to be sucked in, sort of locked into that trauma bond, and then you both won't be able to go after your true calling in the same way. So it'll cost you time, it'll cost you energy, it'll probably cost you 5 to 10 years of your life. It'll cause you to put effort into a business that might not be sustainable or be part of your higher purpose. So that's why if you can do this work ahead of time, it really saves you a lot of money in the long run. I found. Yep.
Why should somebody be willing to learn about what's holding them back through their trauma pattern? What would the the end goal? What would be the results that they will gain from finding out what their trauma pattern is?
So it all depends on the person, really. But what I've found is that You can have somebody who, for example, is in the completely wrong industry. And you find out what your trauma pattern in is, and you understand then, oh my God, I'm in the completely wrong industry. I've been trying to be something that I am not, which is why I haven't found the level of success that I want. So that's one example. Another example is you might figure out your trauma pattern and realize that you've been trying to prove yourself for years to your father, and that proving only got you to a certain level in business. But if you can move out of that as your fuel and start trying to find some positive ways of fueling yourself, the impact you have on the community might be 10x, right? So for each person, what I would say is a common theme is most entrepreneurs find me because they're like, I know there's more to me. I know there's more I can produce, but for some reason I'm holding myself back and I don't know what that reason is and I can't see it. It's something in my blind spot. And so really the blind spot ends up being those 11 million data points running your subconscious every second versus your conscious thought, which is only 40 data points. So people usually are like, okay, just siphon through that subconscious for me. Tell me what the thing is that's in my blind spot and then help me reset my business according to a healthier pattern. Like I had one gentleman the other day, he's running 5 businesses right now. We identified a pattern from his childhood where he would spend the majority of his time trying to manage people's emotional states around him instead of growing the business. I'm like, well, what are you doing right now? It's the same thing. It's 5 different businesses. You're managing everyone's emotions, but the businesses themselves aren't actually growing. He's like, so what are you saying? And I said, well, you have to decide which of these businesses you're most passionate about. Put all your energy into that because that's your history of success. When you put all of your energy into one business only, massive success, exited it. But now you're distributing yourself across 5 different businesses and you don't have the energy, time, or effort for it. So literally within 2 weeks, he called me. He's like, guess what? I sold one business. I got rid of the other two. I handed another business to my wife and I'm doing the last business. And we've seen a huge uptake in the money that we're making and the excitement of our current team. I was like, all right, that's what I like seeing.
That
So
is,
sometimes it's the harsh
that is
truth,
so
but
fascinating and so important for
it
anybody,
is.
for any entrepreneurs that are growing their business.
We only have one life. We have one life. We have one calling. We're here to learn from these trauma patterns and to take our life's lesson into the world. And if we don't learn that lesson, we don't know if we're really in sync with our calling. And then we don't know what our legacy is supposed to be. So I think this is a much greater story that we're here to tell from these patterns. And the more in alignment we get with our true selves, the more we create in business that's helpful for the world.
That is awesome. So we were just talking about partnership. Obviously, people getting married and doing all of that. That's a
Yes.
huge partnership as well. Um, can you talk a little bit about that trauma
Yes.
now taking it into like a relationship based, and how can people choose a better partnership, you know, to do life with?
So this is one of my favorite questions because what I see all the time with very, I would say successful entrepreneurs is that you can only grow your business to a certain level unless you have stability in your home environment. And I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs who have come to me and said, I really want to grow my business. I want to take it to the next level, but I just don't feel like my relationship is where I want it to be to go to that next level. And so that's where you end up seeing a lot of these divorces and things that happen because people, when they meet their person, sometimes they trauma bond to that person because they're both trying to solve a trauma from when they were both young kids. So, for example, right, if I was dating someone, I might think to myself, wow, well, this isn't a normal thought, but I think this. I'm like, wow, that person is a complete reflection of stuff I have with my dad and stuff I have with my mom. Is that really what I want? Or am I trying to heal something from being a little kid who needs X, Y, or Z? And so a lot of people end up together because they've trauma bonded. And then a lot of people end up being in a relationship because and creating a lot of instability in the partnership because they haven't done that work. But I always believe that every couple meets because they're supposed to be healing partnerships for each other. And you just have to decide, are you willing to do the work with this person you're with right now? Or do you want to close off and complete and try it with somebody else? Because you're going to replay the same pattern if you want to, or if you don't, if you haven't done the work.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of creates some conflicts for, like, people in relationship that are married?
Yes.
because of the trauma that they've had in the past?
100% it does. And one of the gentlemen that I worked with, he's like, Annie, could you just put down like 7 things that I could say to de escalate conflict in my home so that I have more stability there? And then I realized all the men that I was coaching, they're like, yeah, I want those phrases. What were those phrases? And so I figured if you're okay with it, I might share the big phrase that really,
Absolutely. That would be
okay.
fantastic. Yeah.
So this is the phrase for all the men listening and for the woman listening too. I'll tell the woman's side. For the men listening, if you want to de escalate conflict immediately with your spouse, the second she comes to you when she's ramped up or she's triggered or she's upset or annoyed, the very first thing you say to her, whether it is true or not, is you say, I'm so sorry I hurt your feelings. And you say this over and over again until she eventually quiets and she usually will cry. Because most women, we've had our feelings hurt so many times, but no one's ever acknowledged it. And if you're the man that acknowledges it, then they can let down their guard, they can soothe, they can calm because they know that you are safe. So I'm so sorry I hurt your feelings. And as a man, you get quieter and quieter as you say it. You get closer and closer to her as you say it until eventually you're touching her, looking into her eyes, saying, I'm so, so sorry that I hurt your feelings.
Boom.
Boom.
This is so fantastic. Um,
That's for the men. Yes.
More phrases, please. Let's go.
All right. So the other phrase for women to say to men, and this is what I really like. Once I discovered this and I found this out from one of the coaches that I was working with, because I was always trying to make my relationship better. Because I was like, if my relationship isn't the way I want it to be, then how are we supposed to do great things in business together? And my relationship coach had told me, she's like, you know what? For men, they feel so disrespected when you don't trust them and you don't listen to what they have to say because they've gone through so much to have that lesson because it's a hard lesson one usually. And so for a woman, if you want to de-escalate with your man, the first thing you say to him is you say, I'm so sorry I disrespected you. I'm so sorry I disrespected you. And if you can for a man, you want to touch him at the same time because that touch is how most men hear and learn things better. And I used to joke, and I know this is probably going to go viral if I say this, but I used to joke that if you can also take off an article of clothing as you're having this conversation, it tends to work with the men, right? Especially if it's your significant other, because they're like, I'm focused now. I'm focused. Yes. What did you want to say to me? So I try to make it fun because, you
Yeah.
know, conflict in relationships is so hard to manage. And for most of us as entrepreneurs, you know, we've put so much time and effort into our businesses that sometimes our relationships suffer. And so what I really wanted to do is make sure if I'm going to work with anybody, let's make your business life amazing. Let's make your relationship life amazing. Let's make sure you have a great relationship with your kids.
That was fantastic, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, I'm definitely going to be using that phrase, with my wife, and obviously sharing the podcast with her as well. So we are nearing the end of the
Went
talk
by
show.
so quickly.
Yes,
Goodness.
it's been probably like over an hour, but we're having fun.
We are.
So this is some quick, heavy hitter questions that we're gonna go through. So, what is the $1 million advice that you would give to somebody? If you had to give one piece of advice to help somebody make $1 million, what would that be?
My piece of advice, if I wanted to help somebody make $1 million, would be I want you to wake up every morning and I want you to visualize that you already have $1 million in your bank account. Visualize you already have that money, feel the feeling of having that money, and then decide what behavior pattern would you change to be worthy of that experience of having that money in your bank account. And it will change how you go about business. And it will really, if you stay in that feeling, it will attract more of that multi-million-dollar business to you.
Boom, fire. If you had to share the best 3 growth hacks in 60 seconds, what would you say?
3 growth hacks in 60 seconds. Eat something good in the morning to replenish your body. Make sure you're working out consistently. And I would say the last piece is always be learning because the learning culture of your company is what directs the growth of your company, especially the growth of revenue. So if you're, say, 80% of the time working on business, but 20% of the time learning and growing, that's the best way to grow your business and move it forward.
Fantastic. What would you? What was the best advice you've ever received from a mentor?
I know this sounds a little bit selfish, maybe, but the best advice I ever received was make sure that you set your own excellence so that you're in your own excellent pace and you disregard pretty much what everybody else needs from you to make sure that you set your tone and your mood for the day.
That is fantastic. If you had to start over your business from scratch
Yes.
after you lost everything today, what would you do?
I would do the exact same thing that I'm doing today, honestly. I would just find new clients, right? If it was all, because this happened, a couple of years ago in the divorce process, right? I had to restart from scratch. And I finally realized I'm like, well, now I can do what I've always wanted to do, which is just privately coach people into the highest level of who they can be. And they get to celebrate because usually then you get to help their families and their businesses and you have a lifelong friendship then because of all the change you've created in their lives. And that's all I really wanted. I wanted a bunch of amazing people that live life on their terms and are super passionate about it.
That is so fantastic. What is the most common advice, or what is the most common advice that you've give to people as you work through them with different businesses? What is the most common thing that you see in people, and what is the advice that you give them?
So the most common thing I see in people is people will always ask me at the beginning of the process, if I do this work with you, am I going to lose my competitive edge? Am I going to lose that thing that like sets me apart from everybody else? And I'm like, if you do this work, that competitive edge, that thing that you love the most, it's going to become so much more powerful so that you will be able to do more things in your genius zone without even thinking. And so that would be the one thing I would tell you is don't worry about losing your competitive edge. Most people are probably at 70% of where they could be. And once you do that work, that edge becomes not even your biggest asset anymore. So it's worth the jump. It's worth the leap.
That is fantastic. That was so fantastic having you on the show. And
Thank you.
I know that like we only scratched the surface today.
We did.
There is so much stuff, so many great things that I know that I've learned from you in the past, from all the presentation that you've had at Collective Genius and BA. Man, so fantastic to have you today on the show. If anybody watching this and would like to get in contact with you,
Yes.
how can they get a hold of you?
Best way to get in touch with me is through Instagram right now. So northstarleadership.annie. And you can find me there. You can DM me. You can also just send me an email directly, Annie, ANNIE, at northstarleadershipschool.com.
Awesome. If you had to give one elevator pitch of what No Star is,
Mm,
like think about like it's a 1 minute reel that you were going to be
sure.
putting on social media. What would that be about No Star leadership, and why would somebody choose to work with you?
I would say probably that North Star leadership is the fastest way to accelerate your leadership, build stronger partnerships, and take that 7-year-old out of the driver's seat of your business so that the adult genius can step in and create its legacy.
Awesome. Any parting advice or anything that you would like to share with anybody watching?
I would love to tell all the men listening that there's a book you get to read to improve your relationship. It's called The Way of the Superior Man by David Data. Even if you don't agree with all of it, it will be almost like an interesting Bible of knowledge that will change your world with regards to your relationship. And then for the women who are listening, because most of us as women struggle with knowing our own self worth, there's a book called It's Not Your Money by Tasha Silver. If you want to increase your self worth, but also increase the money that you make, It's Not Your Money by Tasha Silver.
Boom. There you have it. Again, so fantastic to have you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for coming in the show. That was a wealth of knowledge, that all the truth and the bomb that you dropped today, just like so fantastic. So thank you so much for being here. Again, if you want to get in touch with Annie, go to her Instagram and connect with her, and you would not regret it. Let's go, baby. It's fire.